Emma smiled as she turned the brass key and pushed open the heavy wooden door of her new home. The realtor had called it a hidden gem, but it felt more like an old relic than a house, with walls that seemed to pulse with history. Emma loved the way the creaky floorboards felt beneath her feet and the cozy, dim glow of the wood-paneled walls. This was going to be her fresh start, she thought. A chance to rebuild a life she'd left behind after the divorce. "Come on, kids. Time to see the new house," she called out to her two children, Sarah and Jamie, who had been loitering by the car, staring at the looming Victorian structure as if it were a ghost. "Mom," Sarah whispered, hesitant, "it feels weird." "Nonsense, honey," Emma replied, forcing a smile. "It's just new. You'll get used to it." But as they stepped inside, Emma couldn't shake a prickling at the base of her spine, a feeling like the house was somehow watching them. The first night was peaceful, albeit full of creaks and strange drafts. Emma brushed it off as the quirks of an old house. But as the days passed, the house's eccentricities grew harder to ignore. Every morning, she found their belongings slightly rearranged, though she was certain of where she'd left them. Picture frames hung at odd angles, and doors that she had closed before bed were wide open by dawn. One morning, Jamie came down for breakfast pale and nervous, clutching a crumpled drawing. "Mom, the house was moving last night," he whispered, sliding the paper to her. The drawing was of a house with huge, hollow eyes and a wide, crooked mouth, with tendrils that reached out like clawed fingers. It looked eerily like their own home. "Oh, Jamie, you just had a nightmare," Emma assured him, though the image unsettled her. She pushed it out of her mind, chalking it up to a child's imagination. But that night, lying awake, she heard something that sounded like a whisper, a slow, deep exhale echoing down the hall, as if the house itself was breathing. The real trouble began the following Monday when she dropped the kids off at school. On her way back, Emma felt a strange sensation tugging at her chest, as though she'd forgotten something important, no, something vital. A magnetic pull drew her back to the house. The moment she stepped over the threshold, the air felt thick, oppressive, almost possessive. She felt trapped but couldn't understand why. She tried to shake the feeling, but as the days went on, the house's hold over her tightened. Her sleep grew restless, her dreams full of warped, whispering walls, tendrils that ensnared her as she tried to leave, and distorted faces peering at her from the shadows. One morning, Jamie asked, "Mom, why are all the windows locked?" Emma's heart skipped. She hadn't touched the windows. When she tried to open one, it was sealed shut, immovable despite her best efforts. Every exit was locked, as if the house was tightening its grip. She felt a mounting dread, but refused to admit it to herself, not yet. One Saturday, she invited a few friends over for lunch to help her settle in. But as soon as her guests arrived, the atmosphere shifted violently. The house grew darker, the air colder, and an oppressive silence fell, broken only by the occasional creak that felt like footsteps moving closer. Her friends remarked on it, uneasy glances darting to the shadows that seemed to shift just out of sight. "Oh, it's just the old pipes," Emma lied, her voice wavering. Halfway through lunch, one friend excused herself to use the bathroom, but she didn't come back. Emma eventually went looking for her and found her standing in the upstairs hallway, staring blankly at a wall, her face drained of color. Are you all right?" Emma asked. Her friend blinked slowly, as if waking from a trance. I think I should go," she stammered, eyes darting around as if something unseen were watching her. "I don't feel right here." By the end of the afternoon, all her friends had left hurriedly, claiming strange feelings of unease, migraines, or dizziness. None of them returned her calls afterward. As the weeks dragged on, the house grew increasingly possessive. Every time Emma tried to leave, she felt an invisible pull urging her to stay. The walls seemed closer, the shadows more pronounced. She heard whispers echoing down the hallways, unintelligible but always tinged with a sinister familiarity. One night, she awoke to the sensation of being watched. She turned and froze, her heart pounding. There, on the wall opposite her bed, a faint, grotesque face was forming, eyes hollow and wide, a mouth gaping in a sinister grin. She blinked, and it faded, but the feeling of dread lingered. And every time she ushered the children out for school, the house grew visibly agitated. One morning, as she hurried them out, she felt a violent tug on her foot, nearly tripping her. It was as if the house was trying to keep them inside. One afternoon, Emma decided to leave the house and take a walk, hoping fresh air would ease her nerves. But as she reached the door, her phone rang. The screen read, "Private number." She answered, and a deep, distorted voice whispered, "Don't leave me." She dropped the phone, her hands shaking. It was the house, it had to be. She couldn't deny it any longer. But no one would believe her. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted them. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The whispers had returned, more insistent than ever. This time, they spoke in her voice, echoing her own thoughts, her fears. "They don't need you. No one does." The walls seemed to close in, and she could feel a heartbeat reverberating around her, a steady, mocking rhythm. One night, Emma stayed up, pacing the floors, desperate for a solution. When she paused by the living room wall, she noticed something strange, words etched faintly into the wallpaper. "They belong here," it read. Her breath caught. Below it, in faint, crooked handwriting, "Or you." Emma's heart thundered as she realized what the house wanted. It wanted them, her children, or her. A horrid, sickening bargain presented itself in her mind. She had to make a choice. Before she could process the terrifying offer, a new horror unfolded. As she reached to steady herself against the wallpaper began to peel, revealing a pulsating, fleshy mass beneath, a grotesque reminder that this house was alive, and it was waiting. It wasn't just a prison, it was a predator, biding its time. Emma stumbled back, clutching her chest, horror dawning in her eyes as the full realization set in. The house wasn't just haunted, it was sentient. And it was willing to do anything to keep them trapped forever. The following night, sleep became a battle that Emma knew she was losing. Shadows twisted and churned, reshaping into nightmarish shapes along her bedroom walls, and the whispers that had haunted her grew louder, taunting her as she lay helpless in her bed. In the small hours of the morning, she heard a noise, a scraping sound, like nails dragged across the wooden floor. She shot upright, clutching the covers. The door creaked open slowly, inch by agonizing inch, though she hadn't touched it. She held her breath, listening as the shuffling steps grew closer, until finally, they stopped just outside her door. A faint voice, distorted but familiar, called from the hall, "Mom? Sarah?" Emma whispered, a chill running through her veins. But the silence that followed was suffocating. She willed herself to move, to get up and check on her children, but her body felt as if it were bound by invisible chains. Slowly, she turned her gaze back to the door. A pale, faint outline of a face appeared against the wood, a child's face, empty-eyed, mouth open in a silent scream. Emma clamped her hand over her mouth, stifling her own scream, her heart hammering wildly. The next morning, she made the decision to leave. No matter how tightly the house held onto them, they had to try. The house seemed to sense her intentions, however, because by the time she made it down the stairs with Sarah and Jamie, her car keys had vanished. "Mom?" Jamie asked nervously, clutching her arm. He seemed to sense her fear. "We're leaving, Jamie. We have to get out of here," Emma whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. As they stepped toward the door, the air grew thick and stifling. It was as though the house was breathing down their necks. Just as she reached for the doorknob, the floor seemed to shift beneath her, and her vision blurred. She steadied herself, but in that split second, Jamie let out a yelp, stumbling backward as an unseen force pulled him away from her. "Jamie," she screamed, her voice echoing through the empty hallway. She reached for him, but the door slammed shut with a force that reverberated through the walls. She turned, frantically searching for Sarah, but her daughter was gone. Panic flooded her. She pounded on the walls, screaming for her children. Shadows flickered around her, faces shifting in and out of the dark, watching her with hollow eyes. Hours passed, and darkness fell, leaving Emma stranded, alone and helpless. The house was punishing her for trying to leave. She could feel its malice pressing down on her, an almost physical weight that threatened to crush her spirit. It was as if the walls themselves had come alive, closing in around her, warping into a maze that led her in circles. In a frenzy, she searched every room, every corner, for her children. The whispers taunted her with chilling clarity now, calling her name, weaving in fragments of memories she'd buried long ago. In the kitchen, the wallpaper peeled back, revealing more words scrawled in jagged letters, "They will never leave you." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. In a low, broken voice, she whispered, "What do you want?" The answer was immediate, reverberating through the walls, a cacophony of voices layered atop each other. "They belong here. Forever." As she lay there, her mind racing, she became aware of a flickering glow in the next room. Gathering the last reserves of her courage, she staggered to her feet and followed the light, drawn like a moth to the flame. The glow led her to the basement door, which she had never dared open. The basement stairs creaked beneath her weight, and the air grew colder, damp and heavy with the scent of rot. She could feel the house's eyes on her, its presence pressing down with a malevolent glee. At the bottom of the stairs, she found her children. They stood side by side, eyes glassy, their faces pale as though entranced. And standing before them was a figure, a grotesque shadow, its features shifting and twisting as it breathed. It reached out a hand to her, its fingers long and claw-like. The whispers returned, filling her mind, speaking with the voices of her children, her friends, even her own voice echoing back to her. "If you want them, you must stay. They are part of me now." Emma's heart sank as the full horror of the house's demand dawned on her. It wasn't enough to claim her children, it wanted to keep her, forever entwined within its walls. "Let them go," she begged, her voice hoarse with desperation. The shadow leaned closer, its breath cold and rancid. "You may leave, but they cannot." Or, it trailed off, letting the horrifying alternative settle between them. The choice was excruciating. Either she stayed, bound to this living nightmare, or she left, but her children would remain trapped. Emma's mind raced. She couldn't abandon Sarah and Jamie to this horror, but the thought of surrendering herself was equally unbearable. Desperation gave her courage as she whispered, "Take me, but promise they can go free." The shadow stilled, considering her offer, before slowly nodding. Emma felt a terrible weight lift from her shoulders, even as a bone-deep dread settled in its place. She knew what this choice meant, what it would cost her, but she couldn't live with herself if she left them behind. The shadow stretched out its hand, and Emma took it, feeling its cold, unnatural flesh closing around her own. As she did, she felt her strength fading, as if the life were being siphoned from her. "Go," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Get out, and don't come back." Sarah and Jamie seemed to wake from their trance, their eyes clearing as they looked at her, confused and frightened. She pushed them toward the stairs, forcing herself to stay steady as her body grew weaker. They hesitated, but something in her eyes compelled them to obey. Without looking back, they ran up the stairs, and she heard the front door creak open, then slam shut as they escaped. The moment they were gone, the shadow released her, and she collapsed to the floor, her body frail and cold. She tried to stand, but her limbs felt heavy, weighted down by an unseen force. As she lay there, the walls around her began to shift, slowly drawing closer. The room became darker, as if the house itself were closing in, swallowing her whole. Her last conscious thought was of her children, free from this place, safe from the horrors she would now face alone. Then, silence. The house had claimed her. But unbeknownst to Emma, the house wasn't finished. It had gained what it wanted, her presence, her essence, woven into its very walls. But with Emma's sacrifice came something new, something even the house couldn't have foreseen. Emma had not left alone. A fragment of her spirit had escaped, a lingering tether connected to her children. The house had taken her, but the fight wasn't over.